Welcome to the Lemons and Pineapples podcast. I'm your host, Emma O'Brien, personal development coach, heart math practitioner, dog photographer, and entrepreneur. In this podcast, I share tools, strategies, and amazing guest interviews to help you improve your mindset and your well-being with a sprinkle of fun and probably some mention of dogs along the way. So without further ado, let's squeeze the day. Hi folks, welcome to episode 46 of the podcast. Today my guest is Suzanne Jabour and we're talking about how to support somebody who is grieving. Suzanne is a grieving mum who has found meaning in her loss through providing grief education, sharing how grief really works and how we can support people experiencing it. She works with organizations and businesses to build the skills and protocols to better support people who are grieving at work. And she is available as a speaker to share her story and help normalize grief as a healthy response to losses, big and small. She has a BA and a B.Ed and decades of experience as a trainer. And she's also a certified grief educator, transformational coach, and workshop leader. Welcome to the podcast, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here and for sharing what is a vulnerable thing for you and talking about a subject that I think is still very taboo in our society. So I'm going to jump straight in with this and ask you, nobody really knows what to do with grief. I think we often get very, very awkward around it. So can you share a little bit about what grief is and what the process looks like for people?
So everyone defines grief slightly differently. Here's my broadest definition. As you said, grief is the healthy response to loss of all kinds. So we kind of understand that it happens with the loss of a person, of a loved one. We get it that it could happen for some people with pets. There's still lots of taboo around grief with the loss of a pet. And we really want to ignore it as much as possible in every other aspect of our lives. And we kind of want to ignore it in those ones as well. And I think you're right. There still is this weird taboo. And I think as a collective, our hope is that grief will be handled quickly, privately, and quietly. And we won't really need to talk about it or understand anything about it or touch it or think about it.
Yeah.
The reality is that none of that actually works. And what's happening is that in times of grief and loss, which if we're looking at the world around us for the last, 3.5 years, and certainly in this moment, we're recording in November of 2023, normal is unprecedented levels of disruption and wars all around the world and the environment falling apart and our structures falling apart and, social justice issues are at the fore. And so if we think about grief in its broadest sense, we're actually all experiencing grief quite regularly in our lives, but we don't call it that. And we don't work our way through it thoughtfully that way. And so that's part of what I really want to help people disrupt a little bit for themselves, because I really think that what we see happening right now with so many people feeling short-tempered and lashing out at each other and just such levels of frustration and what we're calling stress is this unprocessed emotional burden that we're all carrying because we have this taboo and we don't know how, we don't want to talk about it. And really, what grief universally needs is witnessing, right? Everything else about it is completely unique. It's this universal experience that happens to each of us differently as individuals. So you would grieve differently than I would grieve. And also every time it happens to you, it's different. So it's really this kind of amorphous thing. The one truth about it is it needs witnessing. And right now we're not witnessing the grief around us. And so I do that all the time in conversations. And I would love for your audience to come on this mission with me. When someone's talking about something that happened to them or a loss they experienced, it would be really helpful to just explore whether there's grief attached, whether we can even get to naming it that. Because grief also, I saw this brilliant definition the other day, and I won't quote it because I'll get it wrong, but the gist of it was that it was conflicting emotions that came out of unwanted change.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a brilliant description, because that's a great marker, right? If you have all these conflicting emotions, I remember saying to my daughter in the very early days after my son died that we were going to become masters in holding paradox, because it really is that both and all the time. I would say to her, like, we can be so happy people are coming to visit us and so devastated because why they're coming is that he's died. And it is that conflicting emotions. I thought that was such a great definition for people trying to explore whether that's part of what's going on for them, that maybe haven't lost a loved one recently, but they just feel that sense of overwhelm, that sense of emotions rising up for no apparent reason, right? That's another really great marker of grief, that you're activated all the time, right? That the littlest thing will happen and it just feels like an explosion inside you. All of those things are markers of grief. And I think if we talk about it and we understand how it really works, right? The sleep disruption, the heightened sense of anxiety for many of us, disruption in our digestive systems, there's physiological things that happen to us as well. And they're all normal, but because we don't talk about it, we don't know that. So when it happens to us as a griever, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I don't even know what to do next, because my son has died. So I have that level of catastrophic loss. I'm no longer the person I was. I was very clear that the person who went to bed that night was not the person that hung up the phone from the call from the police. I was gone. So I'm grieving his loss. I'm grieving the loss of myself. And then evidently I have some version of instant onset brain disease because my brain no longer functions. Well, in fact, I had brain fog, grief brain, very normal, should have been expected. I absolutely know now, looking back, that my mom had it when my dad died. I didn't know what it was. She didn't know how to name it. She made all kinds of weird decisions. And now I feel so much grace for her that I didn't feel at the time, because I didn't understand. So if we could understand, that also opens the door for us to support each other better.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've had incidences recently with two people that I know, not people that are close, but people, kind of acquaintances who are going through a grief process. And the one thing I have noticed is there's a lot of shame around it. So I've got one person who's a client who I actually did a photo shoot for her dog who was terminally ill, and she wanted some nice pictures before she had to let him go. And we went on a Zoom to go through the pictures, and she said to me, I apologized, I'm probably going to cry. So I said, well, please don't apologize, because I kind of thought you might do, and it's okay. And she said, I have feeling such a deep grief for this dog, I'm almost embarrassed that I'm grieving like this for a dog. And I think that's where another taboo comes in, like, oh, it's just a dog, it's not a person. But he's been a dog who was in her life for 10 years, and he's been her constant companion. And I had my coaching hat on with it, and I had to say to her, it's okay, it's understandable. I understand, I've got dogs, I've lost 2 dogs in the last year as well, and I understand it's a huge loss. And then I've had somebody else who I know whose mum passed away a week ago, and she was unwell. So I think on some level it was a relief for everybody that she was out of pain. Then of course people feel guilty for feeling the relief. And then she said, I find myself laughing about something, and then I'm thinking I shouldn't be laughing about this because my mum just died. And I think it's all of these things that people just don't talk about. It's not a linear process,
No.
but it's how do we let go of the shame around it? How do we let go of the guilt around when there is a light moment, even though something, there's been a loss and something heavy has happened?
For me, the most critical thing, and I think the way to release a whole bunch of that, is about really giving yourself radical permission for all of it to be okay. For whatever comes to be all right. It's not going to be what you wanted, right? None of us wants to lose a pet or a mother or a child or a relationship or a job or a business or anything, but it's the reality of what happens. And unfortunately, because of that taboo we were talking about, we don't get that permission to feel it all from society, from our friends, from our family. So we have to give that permission to ourselves first. And what that does is it really allows us to release all of the weird stories that society tells us about how grief is supposed to go, how we're supposed to do it, which, as I said, is preferably quickly, quietly, privately, you know, which is so ridiculous, because the reality is, as you say, you're overwhelmed with tears at one moment and you're laughing the next. And that's that conflicting emotions, right? And that sense of, yes, this awful thing has happened, and we have to deal with the emotions that come from that. And at the same time, life is carrying on. And so if there are moments of lightness, that's okay. That's the balance. And if there aren't, that's also okay.
Yeah.
But there isn't that sense of permission for it all to be acceptable. There's a way we're supposed to do it, which doesn't even have anything to do with the theories or the research or the knowledge or the anything. It's all old stories. I blame it on the 50s. I think it's all from that kind of Leave It to Beaver era, right? Where how you presented was so important. And we've left so much of that behind. And then we still have this taboo around this really emotional thing. And what makes me saddest about that is, for people who can break through that taboo and really be vulnerable and honest, both as the griever and as the person supporting them, it's an incredible time of deep connection and deep understanding of each other. And you get to know each other. Like the people who were able to stand by me, and it was a small but mighty group, that I will be connected to them in a different way than other people in my life for the rest of my life. And so if we can, break that taboo, move past the fear we feel, because that's the other piece with things that are taboo that we don't talk about, that we don't really understand. We feel a lot of fear. We don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to do the wrong thing. We don't want to remind the person. We don't want to make it worse. That's all, again, story. It's all made up shenanigans, right? It has nothing to do with reality. The reality is, if you just say that, right? The 3 or 4 people that really were able to stand by me, almost to a one, started that relationship by saying something like, I have no idea what to say, and I don't really know what to do. And I love you and I care about you. And this is the most awful thing I can imagine. And we're going to figure it out.
Yeah.
Nobody expects that you know everything. None of us do. As a griever, I didn't know, and I was in the mess of it. So if we can just understand and acknowledge with, as you say, no shame, no blame, we are all terrible at grief.
Yes, we are.
We're just terrible at it.
Yes,
we're terrible at it. So let's start there. Let's own it.
Yeah.
Because when we own it, we can do better, right? We can have these conversations. We can say things like, I don't really understand grief. I don't really get it. Like, I heard this podcast and they were talking about it and I didn't really get it, but I understand it a little bit more. And what would happen if we opened up those conversations in safe spaces, right? We all have safe people in our life that we can share anything with, right? So what if we shared this piece of our ignorance and then we learned together?
Yeah. Yeah. And
that would change everything.
It would change everything. And I think that the question I have for you is, it's grief is something I find awkward. Okay, so I'm British, so I'm a, I've got a badge of awkward already. And like I shared with you, the 2 people I've spoken to in the last week who were grieving are people who were relatively removed from me, I suppose. So I can hold space because they're, one was on the other side of a Zoom call and the other one was popping in to pick something up and leaving again. So I had limited interaction. What I found very difficult, and I'm curious as to your feedback on this, is last year my stepmom passed away, and my dad is in the UK, so I'm in South Africa, so we've got a bit of a continent gap. And here comes my father, who for the majority of my life hasn't been very emotional, all of a sudden became incredibly emotional. And I sat, I think, like a deer in headlights, thinking, I don't know what to do with this. And I almost want to make it stop. So I got better as the process went along, but I would sit on the telephone with him and he'd be upset, and I'd be thinking, I'd kind of need this to stop, because I don't know what to do with this. I want to be supportive, but I don't know how, because the parent that I knew is, like you've said with you, the parent that I knew is no longer now. His life has been turned upside down and he's changed. And it's, even a year and a bit later, he still gets quite emotional. But I think I've got better at dealing with it, because it's not quite so, so sort of random. It's a bit more under control. And I think this is we can't control grief. And I think that's what's frightening about it. But I'm interested in your feedback in what I've shared, because I imagine I'm not alone being the only person who's gone, this is really awkward. I don't know what to do, And then I think the danger is that you almost distance yourself from the person who needs you the most, because you don't know what to do. So tell me more about that.
And you're 100% right. And first of all, if your dad is listening, I want to give him a huge shout out, because I know as a British man of a certain generation, that stiff upper lip is firmly entrenched. So for him to be able to be that open and vulnerable, maybe when he didn't necessarily do that by choice, right? He was probably not thinking, oh, I'm going to all of a sudden be open and vulnerable and emotional with my lovely daughter. So it's by necessity, right? It's a matter of survival that you have to let all that emotion out, because otherwise you'll explode. And you have to talk. You have to share the story. You have to talk about your person. You have to talk about what's going on for you. And the beautiful thing about this is that really all that person needs of you is to be witnessed. That's all they need. There's no fixing it. There's nothing to be fixed. Nothing is broken. This is just reality. There's no fixing it. There's no really doing anything except listening. And I know you were talking a little bit about holding space for people, and really that's the key. And for people who aren't really familiar with that concept, I'm going to share the funniest definition of it I ever heard. I was walking the dog and I passed a younger couple, and I heard the woman say to the man, well, you understand how to hold space, right? And I thought, oh, this is some kind of test. And I just had enough to hear him say, well, yeah, that's when you just listen without saying anything. And I thought, okay, well, that's a very good baby definition of how to hold space. So if that's where you're at, that's really the beginning. Just listen without saying anything. You can empathize, right? Oh my gosh, I can hear how painful that is. You can reflect, right? That's a reflection. Oh my gosh, I understand that you're feeling overwhelmed. I can hear the emotion in your voice. You don't need to fix it. Oh, they would want you to be happy. Never say that again. They're in a better place. Never again. At least they're not suffering. Don't say that either. Like all those things we've been kind of enculturated to say that we've heard in the past. I blame that all on the 50s too. It doesn't work anymore. So what we need to say is things like, oh my gosh, I can really hear that this is big. And I'm just here to listen. Whatever you need to say, I'm here to listen. That's it. It's that permission piece again, right? Giving permission. And I'm sure I was very similar to your dad in that I think as a grieving parent, grieving out loud, I'm sure I was terrifying to many people. And also not a good first assignment, right? So if you're not very comfortable with your emotions, if you're not familiar a little bit with grief, I am not a good first assignment in that stage. Sometimes it's the assignment you get given anyway, but that's part of why we can practice with these other losses, right? Loss of a job, that's a different level of grief. We can have a different level of conversation, and we get to practice those skills and build our muscle. So when your dad's life is thrown up and he's living in a post-apocalyptic nightmare, that's what it feels like. That's what it felt like for me. You don't understand how the world works anymore. Your world as you knew it no longer exists. Everyone else seems to be carrying on like nothing happened. It's very disorienting. And it's a lot of emotions. It's that conflicting emotions. My daughter, I remember her saying, oh my gosh, Mama, it's like all the emotions all the time. Like at the same time, it's all of them. Yeah, it's that tsunami of emotions. So really, yes. And it's okay to say, oh, I feel really awkward. I don't really know what to do for you. So I'm just going to listen. And I really want you to know this is a safe space for you to just share whatever's real for you right now. That's great.
Yep. And I think what you've shared is such a great piece of advice for all sorts of situations in life. That simple phrase of, I feel really awkward right now. I don't know what to say. I don't know what is the right or wrong thing to say. Please help me. What do you need? How can I help you? And I think when people are grieving, and I think this is such an important thing to remember as well, is a grieving person isn't in their rational, logical state of mind. So if you get told to shut the F up and go away, then that's okay. Maybe you do that for a little while, but not to take it personally. And then you can come back. Would you like me to come back yet? You know, can it, because I think that is, it's giving that person, like we said, the space holding for them to allow all of the emotions to come out, to move around, to do what they need to do, and just to be there for people. I guess to pick up the phone every day or send a message every day. Are you okay? Do you want to talk? Because I think the one thing I've noticed, and I'll take this back to an example of one of my friends lost her father. And I have to say, I found it quite difficult because she lent on me an awful lot. And I started to get a little inconvenient for me. And that's a horrible thing to say. And it sounds horrible saying it out loud. But again, I think that's also something people will go through, because there's almost the point at which, can you just deal with this on your own now? I can't keep talking to you about this because my life is moving on and I know yours hasn't.
Yeah.
What's your feedback on that?
It's so interesting. And I think that's part of our lack of understanding about the actual timeline, right? The actual timeline is much longer than we think. It's very normal for that sort of, not the most acute early days, though those acute early days are really months. And the early grief, where you still feel disoriented, where you still need support, where you're still really emotional, is really realistically about 2 years.
Yeah.
So it's much longer than we've been led to believe, because again, we want it to be quick and quiet and private, right? And it's impossible for it to be any of those things. And I think that it is that sense of understanding that you're in it for the long haul. And I remember a friend of mine, one of my stalwart supporters, asking me, I don't know, we were maybe 6 months in, something like that. So it hadn't been very long. And it really was all I could talk about. Really pretty much, at work, I could talk about work, but otherwise it was pretty much all I could talk about. And I remember her saying to me, like, how long are you going to do this for? Like, how long do you think you can do this? And I was so kind of taken aback by that question because I hadn't really thought about it. And I said to her, I think I'm going to be doing this forever. I'm going to be doing this forever. And that realization was so powerful for me, because I realized if this was going to be forever, which of course it is, I will miss my son, your dad will miss his wife, you'll miss your stepmom, your friend will miss her dad, we'll miss all of these people, your client will miss her dog. It's a forever proposition, right? It doesn't stay that raw, and it doesn't stay that overwhelming, and it doesn't stay that post-apocalyptic, right? We do rebuild and, continue on and build a life where we're carrying our loved ones with us. But that realization for me that it was going to be forever gave me some permission to figure out how to live with it.
Yes.
So if it's going to be forever, then I need to figure out what I want that to look like and what I want that to feel like and how I want to do that.
Yeah.
Because I was really clear there was never going to be a time where I wasn't grieving him and didn't miss him every moment of every day. And so how did I build a life alongside that, with that, where I felt like I was moving on with him? And this is the other thing that happens with a lot of those cliches and platitudes, is a lot of them have, there's kind of two pieces of subtext that most of them have. One is, I don't want you to be grieving anymore. So that's those things like, oh, they would want you to be happy. Well, they have nothing to do with it. This is you saying, I can't do this anymore. I need you to be happy, right? That's the subtext of that. The subtext of some of the other ones is about how you should be over it and you should be moving on. And I think that the harm that that does is it sends a message that we're supposed to leave that person behind. Like the subtext of getting through it and moving on is that you're leaving something behind. And I thought, well, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm not leaving him behind anywhere. Like, he's coming with me in a different form. Obviously, he's not here, but we still think about him. We still talk about him. We have rituals that honor him. And everyone should think that that's normal. And I know not everybody does, and that's okay. I'm also done caring about all of your shoulds. It doesn't matter to me. But it all has that entanglement. And I think you're right. I think it's the stories we've been told about how long it should take, right? A couple months, you should be back to normal. It's really not. So if you're a person who really wants to be there because it's a good friend or it's someone that you just empathize so much with their experience, it's partly just understanding it's for the long haul. So plan it that way, set it up that way, and just acknowledge that. And it's okay for there to be an ebb and flow in your support too.
Yes.
Right? You could be in it every day at the beginning and then say, wow, my plate is really full. So I love helping you. And I understand that you're going to need support for a long time. And I am 100% in for that long haul. And this week I can't help.
Yeah.
That's okay. It's all about the honesty piece, right? If both of us can be honest and vulnerable, we can find our way.
Yeah.
But if either one isn't saying what's real for them, that's when we get entangled and it gets muddy. It's all clear. If we're both honest and vulnerable, we can figure it out.
Yes. But I think honesty and vulnerability are two things we struggle with enormously as humans on this planet.
Correct.
I think you've said at the beginning of the conversation, we only have to take a little look outside and see how much we struggle with being able to say, I feel awkward. I don't know what to do. I love you, but I need a bit of space. And I think this is the big takeaway. I mean, there's so much that you've shared of huge value in this conversation, Suzanne. So thank you very much for being here and sharing, is this piece about just the honest communication with each other and just, being vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. That's the whole key. And as you said about, something we were talking about earlier, it's that holding space and listening to people. This honesty and vulnerability is also something that would serve us brilliantly in many parts of our life.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And yes, it's not how most of us were raised. I'm in my mid 50s, 100% not how I was raised. I did a better job, I think, with my kids. And we're doing a slightly better job now, though I think now the youngest generation is all disconnected because they're screen raised, right? They're all spending so much time on their screens, disconnected from human interaction, which is a whole different episode.
Yeah.
But
let's not go into iPad children just yet.
Right? Yeah. Different episode. Very grateful that was not the era I had to raise my kids in. But it is that sense of just needing to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes.
It's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to do things you don't fully know how to do. In other areas of our life, if we think about it, we do things like that all the time. We try a new restaurant. I can't even think. There's a million things we do where we're like, I'm not really sure if this is going to work out, but let's give it a try.
Yeah.
When it comes to that emotional piece, we're so awkward. I love it. I'm just going to embrace the awkward. Right? It's messy and it's awkward, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think if we can normalize that the majority of us were not raised to express our emotions, to be able to name them in a nuanced way, right? We're all many of us stuck at that kind of sad, glad, mad level of understanding our emotions. I say to people all the time, go to Google. Google knows many, many things. Type in feelings wheel or emotions wheel, find one of those wheels and really work at, just for yourself, getting to name better what the emotions are that you're feeling. Because yes, mad, sad, glad, sure. But there's always something more nuanced going on, right? We talk all the time about how angry we are. Angry is an umbrella emotion. Why? How? There's all these other, things that hold that umbrella up. Anger is an umbrella. Many of those ones that we name easily are those umbrellas. And if we can get at the more nuanced naming, what we know about emotions is just naming them helps to move them.
Yeah.
And if we don't want to be holding them all in our body, which is what we've done so far, which has led us to, unprecedented levels of disease, if we want to not do that anymore, then we need to know how to name them. And that also helps us then when we're facing someone, as you did with your dad, right, who's got all these big emotions, if we can name some of them, or we can at least, we're most of us very good in our heads, right? Even if in our heads, we can do it as an intellectual exercise, it's better than not doing it at all. If you can allow it to be an embodied exercise and actually feel where in your body those things are, for most of us, it's our gut, it's our heart, it's in our shoulders and our necks, right? That's where we're carrying all that emotion. So, start to name that and do it when you're not in crisis, right?
Yes.
Do it over those smaller losses. Like, how different would it be if you think about a friend who lost a job recently, because we all have many of those in our lives right now. What if instead of our first comment being, oh, it's their loss, you'll find something better, we go so quickly into cheerleading fixer mode, which is fine, but there's a whole bunch of emotions around losing your job. There's a whole bunch of grief there. So what if the first part of the conversation was, oh my gosh, I can only imagine all the emotions you must be feeling right now. Because I know that job was important to you. It had not only financial security, but it was a part of your identity, and lots of your friends were there, and it gave a shape to your day. Like, it was so many things to you. And that must be bringing up a whole lot of emotions.
Yeah.
What if we started there?
Yes.
Almost every time something goes wrong, what if we start there instead of where we love to start because we want to be in our heads, we want to fix it, we want to do something. You can do all of that next. That should be part 2 of the conversation. But part 1 really could be about that emotional piece. And then we get to practice being awkward, being a little bit uncomfortable, trying to name them, breaking up this kind of weird relationship we have with emotions, which I really think too starts with this concept that there's good emotions and bad emotions. I think that's wildly problematic. We need to break that whole paradigm up. There is just emotions.
Yeah.
They all have a message. They all have something to teach us. They're all there for a reason. None of them are good or bad. They just are. And if we can learn that for ourselves, then when someone's in front of us needing support, who's in that big emotional space, we feel slightly, I'm only going to promise slightly, less awkward.
I have come to accept, and I think this is one thing that I also take from this conversation, is a big part of being able to help somebody who's grieving and to be able to work through your own grief is accepting that it has happened. And we have to accept that we have these emotions. It's part of the human experience, and be more accepting that other people also have them. I think it's this, as soon as we are able to connect with each other better, it not only deepens a relationship you have with somebody, but you're able to support and come back to the phrase of holding space, and to just be with somebody when they're going through a loss. And that's what I hear from a lot of what you've said is people need you to just be there. They don't need you to fix or try and take it away, because you can't make somebody who's feeling deep grief. You can't. There's nothing you could do to make them feel better. Nothing.
Nope.
Apart from,
really, the thing you can do that makes them feel better is to just let them feel it.
Just let them feel it. That's it. And it comes to that. I know it's such a cliched phrase, but it is so true. You have to feel it to heal it. And that coming through to your point about learning to acknowledge our own emotions and feelings, I think helps us more confidently navigate other people's, because if you can recognize them in yourself, you can recognize them in somebody else. And I think the work always starts with us. Personal development work, growth work. Unfortunately for you, it sounds like you were plunged into it really much against your will. And I think what's very powerful is that you have taken the loss of your son and the way you've moved through it, and you've taken it out into the world to help and guide other people through the grieving process. And this work is so important because, like we've talked about today in our conversation, there isn't enough support.
And I think that that's partly because of the taboos, right? That, as a collective, we're not able to support each other. And even at a professional level, I keep reading things from psychologists and therapists and counselors, like the people you think you should be able to turn to, who are also saying they don't know enough, they don't have enough training, they don't, they're awkward and uncomfortable. So, and that's not to say there aren't many skilled and fabulous, grief counselors, therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, many, 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 many. But as a collective, we're not good at it. So we have to disrupt this as a collective. We need everybody to come on board the awkward train with us, right? And just know that it's okay. Why do we have this fear? And I think, when I do a survey, if I'm doing a workshop and I do a survey, have everyone raise their hands, or I do a questionnaire, inevitably the thing that has held people back from showing up for someone the way that they wish they had is fear. It's that fear that we don't want to do the wrong thing. We don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to make it worse. I hear all the time people say, well, I don't want to remind them. You're not reminding them. I will remember every second of every day that Ben has died. The fact that you also remember is a gift to me, because then I'm not alone. Yeah. So that sense that I don't want to remind them, just if you think of something about their person, oh my gosh, they would love to get a message from you saying, oh, I saw this thing. It's one of my favorite things. People will message me and say, oh, I saw this thing and it made me think of Ben because he would have loved it or hated it or thought it was ridiculous or whatever it is. That's a gift to the griever, to know that other people remember too. So that fear, we just have to set it aside. We can't ignore it, right? Because I'm here to telling everyone to feel all their emotions, right? So we can feel the fear and do it anyway. That's what courage is. These are courageous, awkward, vulnerable, messy conversations. And that's okay, because we're just learning.
Yeah.
And when we're learning a new skill, it's messy and awkward and feels weird, right? I mean, try brushing your hair or brushing your teeth or cutting food with the wrong hand, with your non-dominant hand. Awkward, messy, you can't do it very well. You're learning something new. It's okay. We do that all the time. We can do it here.
Yeah. Suzanne, thank you for this very powerful conversation today, and for sharing your experience and your expertise with me and with the audience. I'm sure this will have been a really, really valuable podcast episode for folks to listen to. Where can people get in touch with you online and find out more about your work?
The best place to connect with me is on my website, which is SuzanneJabour.com. So easy to find me there, and there's all kinds of resources and information, and links to all the socials are there. So that's your best one-stop shop.
Perfect. I will pop that in the show notes. Thank you once again for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening, folks. I hope you found this episode really valuable, and I will see you next time. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed it, please share with your friends, and be sure to leave me a 5-star rating and review, especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. To find out more about my one-on-one coaching, please visit my website, which is emmaobriencoach.com. And remember, folks, when life gives you lemons, you can always choose another fruit. See you next time.